thank you for joining CIE's weekly analysis of the Hamas-Israel war with the best analysts from around the world. More than 7 months ago, Hamas and others killed 1,200 people and seized more than 240 hostages in southern Israel. Today's focus is on Rafah, the southern section of the Gaza Strip, and how casualties statistics have influenced and are influencing how the war is interpreted, let alone reported and analyzed. I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education and the Emory Emeritus Professor of Contemporary Middle Eastern History, Political Science, and Israel Studies. We'll start the webinar in a moment as I ask each of our guests to provide a framework for what seems to be the increased targeting of discussion on Rafah, and with it, discussion of the Palestinian population in and around that southern portion of the Gaza Strip adjacent to Egypt, and a corridor of land known as the Philadelphia Corridor, under which Hamas has built, we are told, more than 36 tunnels to allow the flow of building materials, equipment, vehicles, and lots of money into the Gaza Strip. They've been doing that for more than 15 years, while Hamas has operated the Gaza Strip as an autonomous political entity. We invite you to take advantage of the crisp analyses provided by multiple experts and authorities in our previous 30 webinars. Please go to israeled.org, where you may listen to topics such as Israeli women in the war, the Israeli North, U.S. Israel relations, Hezbollah, how Jewish communities around the world have reacted to the war, a fascinating overview of world Jewry, Israel at 76. Come learn with us in an easy and accessible manner, 24/7. Go to israeled.org. Next week, we're going to have a discussion on the campus, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and the unrest that has unfolded since October 7. Join our highly intelligent Israel Zionism content learning community. Come read about how Gen Z has exhibited anti-Semitic outlooks and how anti-Zionism truly is anti-Semitism. If you like what you read and you like what you hear and you like what you learn, the donate button isn't too far away from you. It's on our homepage at israeled.org. More than ever, the public and young adults need to feel confident and at home with Israel's story, maybe even Israel literacy. Today, we're joined by Kobi Michael, a researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies, a panelist on the weekly webinar of March 6th. His knowledge about the Palestinians and Israel's strategy is quite well known in Israel. And a close friend of ours, research assistant Gabriel Epstein, a leading expert on Gaza casualty numbers, having written highly influential summaries on how that data is collected. This past week, there seems to have been more activity outside of the Gaza Strip related to the war. 7 Iranian officials died in a helicopter crash. The International Court of Justice has decided whether Hamas and Israeli leaders are accountable for genocide, to which President Biden commented in the fiercest terms that Israel was not engaging in genocide. There's no moral equivalence, he said, between Hamas, what it inflicted on Israelis, and Israel's response. In Israel, the defense establishment has raised their hand and asked their prime minister for a definitive outline of what the end of the war will look like. Hamas has thwarted another hostage exchange, giving support to the axiom that Hamas negotiates not to reach a conclusion, but just to prolong their engagement. Arab newspapers in different parts of the Middle East continue to praise Hamas for its resiliency and engagement with Israel. More Israeli hostages were announced this week as having died in captivity. Kobi, let me begin with you and ask for an overview of the state of the war. How close is Israel to reaching those conclusions which it set out to make Hamas an inept fighting force and maybe eliminate Hamas as a potential administrator for the Gaza Strip into the future?
Unfortunately, I think that after almost 8 months, Israel only now is beginning to come out from the strategic limbo that we were in the last 3 months or so, or at least since February 24 in Paris, when the more serious negotiation with Hamas about the hostages eventually began with the very deep and significant involvement of the American administration, mainly Bill Barnes, the head of the CIA. And Israel, or the IDF, at the end of January, almost finished to dismantle the centers of gravity of Hamas in Khan Yunis area, which is a very significant center of gravity, at least from the military point of view, but not only, also from the governmental point of view. And this was actually the second phase of the war after the first phase that was taken in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, in the city of Gaza and all the refugee camps and the neighborhoods and the villages that surround the city of Gaza. And we intended to continue in Rafah, but then the negotiation began, and then the American administration began pressuring Israel to delay the operation in Rafah. And then Israel eventually went to a sort of very problematic phase of the war where most of the IDF forces were outside of the Gaza Strip, and eventually, mainly in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, the places that were left by the IDF were refilled by Hamas that showed that it has the capability to recover itself, to regroup itself in a very effective manner. And this was the reason that the IDF found itself in the second, the third, and the fourth time in these areas in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. And last week, we began the operation in Rafah. We are still not in the heart of the city, but we are getting closer and closer to the heart of the city. And once again, we found that the U.S. administration was wrong with its assessments regarding the IDF plans of evacuating Palestinian citizens from Rafah. The American administration said that it is not satisfied yet from the plans that were introduced by the IDF. The American administration was very skeptical with regard to the IDF capability to evacuate the people. And the IDF showed that in less than 10 days, more than 1 million people were evacuated safely from Rafah. But I think that the US administration did a very essential mistake when it halted the shipment of the weapon to Israel and threatened Israel publicly with regard to the operation in Rafah. And I think that this was one step too much. The American approach in this regard does not fit, I would say, the general attitude of the American public in the United States. There is a gap between the general attitude of the public and the approach of the administration. And the administration was criticized even by Democrats about the decisions that it made with regard to Israel. And Israel became much more determined with regard to Rafah, mainly after Hamas launched rockets and mortars from humanitarian area in the Palestinian side of Rafah towards the humanitarian area in the Israeli side, the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is eventually the oxygen pipe of the Gaza Strip. Most of the humanitarian aid goes to the Gaza Strip through Kerem Shalom crossing. Because of this attack, 4 soldiers were killed and 10 were wounded very severely. And Israel retaliated by invading to the eastern part of Rafah, which is not so populated, and Philadelphia corridor towards the Rafah crossing, and actually disconnected Hamas from this crossing and began working and building the capacities for a broader invasion to Rafah. Until today, and after a week, the IDF found more than 70 tunnels. 50 of them are active tunnels that cross the border from the Gaza Strip to Sinai Peninsula. What does it mean? It means that the Egyptians in the Egyptian side of the border eventually are collaborating in a very broad scale with Hamas. Otherwise, there is no explanation to the existence of 50 tunnels, and I assume that there are more than 50 tunnels along the border, which are used as an oxygen pipe for all the terror organizations in the Gaza Strip, mainly Hamas, and they were active until a week ago. So I think that the IDF will continue the operation in Rafah by doing the utmost efforts in order to minimize civilian casualties, as the IDF did very well along the last months of the war. And I think that beyond the dismantling of the 4 battalions of Hamas that were left in Rafah and the governmental infrastructure there, the most challenging issue is the Philadelphia corridor and what is beneath the Philadelphia corridor. And here, Israel and Egypt has to reach to an agreement that should be facilitated by the Americans. What should be done with regard to this infrastructure, how to shut down this infrastructure, and what should be the mechanisms in order to prevent such an infrastructure to be rebuilt. I believe that the IDF eventually will succeed in achieving or realizing the objectives of the war, mainly with regard to Hamas, and to assure that Hamas will be dismantled as a sovereign power in the Gaza Strip. I'm not sure that we will be able to release all the hostages. I believe that most of them are not alive, unfortunately and very sadly. I believe that the IDF will be able to change the entire reality in the Gaza Strip and to prevent Hamas from regrouping itself. And then we will have to find the right mechanism that will be able to control the Gaza Strip, at least from the civilian point of view, where the responsibility for the security will remain in the Israeli hands, exactly as we have the responsibility for security in the West Bank, but it will be along the international border. The IDF will have to mow the grass in a very intensive manner. That means that whenever Hamas or any other terror organization will try to recover itself, the IDF will go in, will mow the grass, will dismantle the infrastructure, will arrest terrorists or will kill the terrorists, and will go back to the international border. Until the IDF will be able to accomplish the mission, I think that we have no option in the northern part of the Gaza Strip but to establish a temporary military administration that will assure a continuing presence of the IDF in a way that will prevent Hamas from regrouping itself in these areas until we will accomplish the mission in the entire Gaza Strip, including Rafah area. I assume that it will take several months, 3 to 4 months, and then I hope that a regional task force will be able to enter and to have the responsibility for the territory, for the population, and for the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip in parallel to the education and training of a local administration that might be affiliated to the Palestinian Authority in this way or another, but it will not be the Palestinian Authority. Then the Palestinian Authority will go through a very significant reform process in order to be revitalized Palestinian Authority according to the definition of President Biden, and under the umbrella of the regional architecture based on the normalization process between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I hope that new spaces of opportunities will be opened that will enable the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the other players here in the region, backed by the Americans, to create a sort of a breakthrough in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Not a solution, not a final agreement or a final settlement, but I think something that will be much better than the current reality, but it will take time, and I assess that it will be not less than 5 years.
Kobi, that's a very fine summary. Gabriel, you've been spending a significant amount of time taking a look at casualty figures, taking a look at how numbers are collected, who does the collecting, how the reporting is made. Give us your insight as to how the casualty figures have been initially enumerated, and then tell us a little bit about how those enumerations have had an impact on how people have understood the war and its unfolding.
It's first good to take a step back and think about what casualty reporting and the health system looks like in Gaza compared to other conflict zones around the world. At first glance, the deck is actually somewhat stacked in favor of Gaza. To draw a comparison to the Ethiopian civil war, the Tigray region has 39 hospitals and over 7 million residents. The Gaza Strip has anywhere between 2.2 and 2.4 million residents, and it has 36 hospitals. Some of them are government, some of them are private, but that's basically triple the number of hospitals per capita. And that's a relevant metric. You also have a relatively strong Ministry of Health, which, whatever the accusations of political bias in previous wars, has performed relatively well. The UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA, has not revised their figures by maybe more than 5 to 6% in the previous rounds of conflict. There's been major disputes in the past over what is the balance of combatants versus civilians, but not so much about the overall number. Those things operate in favor of the Gaza Ministry of Health and its previous conduct in terms of being a relatively robust casualty reporting system. That said, the recording system, even in peacetime, has some pretty unusual features. One is that instead of adhering to the UN definition of what a child is, which would be anyone under 18, or under the age of majority if it's lower in a specific country, they operate under the assumption that anyone between the ages of 0 and 18 is a child. So they do have a different definition, which drags the UN to use their definition of a child when they're using their numbers. And they don't make a distinction between civilians and combatants. That's a best practice for any casualty recording body. But then it's worth talking about, well, what's different about this war versus previous rounds, let's say 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021. And one major difference right off the bat is the role of the United Nations. In the past, the UN, and specifically OCHA, spearheaded something called the Protection Cluster, which monitored in real time what was happening in hospitals. Basically, Hamas would do their own reporting through the Ministry of Health, and the UN would also release a report saying, we believe X number of people were killed, this many of them men, women, and children, and tentatively we have identified this many as civilians and this many as combatants. And they did that based on a mix of interviews on the ground by NGOs of families of those killed, observing in the hospitals what sort of clothing people were wearing and who they were brought in by, methods like that. That enabled them to kind of be an independent real-time check on the Ministry of Health, which had an explicit function, which was to provide an alternative count, which international organizations could then use in other states. And at the same time, it has had an implicit effect, which was that it didn't allow for any kind of funny business with the numbers because there was someone in the hospitals watching you, in a network of NGOs. All of that has disappeared in the current war. From the very start of the war, the UN was clear that it was only relaying the claims from the parties. That goes for both Gaza and for the Israelis. They weren't going to do any sort of independent verification at the time. And that's a critical difference. It removed an independent check. And then the second big difference is the scale of the war. The scale of the war is enormous. In 2014, there was a brief ground invasion that required the evacuation of 5 hospitals, primarily in the center and north. Now, effectively every hospital in Gaza has either been evacuated or had its operations limited at one point or another. Some have gone online, gone offline, come back online. Some that's been due to the work of COGAT to make sure that fuel and medical supplies keep flowing. But the level of damage to the health infrastructure is extreme. It is severe. We shouldn't understate that. And what that led to was that after the first month of the war, the health ministry announced this on November 10th, but in reality, I believe it happened as early as November 2nd or 3rd. They stopped using their peacetime methodology, which relied on the hospital and morgue system, where they would collect bodies, identify them, and then upload the information to a central database. And this is the system that everyone in peacetime and in previous rounds of conflict said worked pretty well. Not perfectly, but pretty well. They dropped that in northern Gaza and Gaza City and replaced it with relying on reliable media sources. And what reliable media sources are is anyone's guess, because despite that being the case for 6 months, the Ministry of Health has never elaborated on what that means. They've been asked directly by reporters and they've refused to answer. I know that both from public articles and from private conversations. Reliable media sources could mean anything, and it's not an illegitimate method of estimating casualties. It's done in places, especially very large battle spaces, where it's difficult to get real-time access. But it's usually done in a backwards-facing way. NGOs like Air Wars will investigate individual strikes based on social media, interviews with people who were there, et cetera, to try and estimate a number of dead. That process takes a very long time. It's not something you can do in real time. So that was the first indication. And the second indication that there was something off about this was that this was not something the ministry was transparent about. The first mention of these media sources came in a report uploaded to their Telegram channel, only in Arabic, buried in a PDF on December 11th. And they've released 41 of those reports since. But that's the second methodology, is these media reports. And then the third methodology was asking relatives of those killed to self-report effectively their family members who have died or who are missing. That was launched in January via Google form, and they released the first results of that methodology at the start of April. And to give you a sense of the balance between these methodologies, the hospital and morgue reports account for about 60% of the total fatality count, so around 20,000. The media reports account for about 30%, close to 10,000, and the self-reports account for about 10%, close to 4,000. So you have essentially 40% of your information about reported deaths coming from methodologies that don't involve an actual body. or physical identification of a body, confirmation of the details, and then uploading to that central database. That is not necessarily unusual, but the fact that all these are mixed together in health ministry reporting is its own problem. Best practices would say that you need to be transparent when you switch from a counting method to something like media reports, which is effectively an estimation method. So you should always disaggregate between your methodologies, and you should be transparent about the limitations of those methodologies. And I'll draw on an example from the UN in Syria, which is that in 2014, after 3 years of tracking casualties in Syria from 7 different organizations, cross-referencing and verifying, the UN gave up in 2014 and said, we can't verify for most of the organizations anymore due to whatever access restrictions and limitations. And they stopped for 7 years reporting a death toll and only resumed when the available streams of information allowed them. So this is one problem, these 3 methodologies of varying levels of reliability. The second problem is that the UN has swapped back and forth between citing from the Ministry of Health, which is the only authorized cohesive body to be doing this sort of collection and counting, and the Government Media Office, which is part of the Hamas-run Ministry of Information. It is effectively the press office for Hamas. It collates a lot of reporting, allegations, accusations, and then repeats them. But it has no ability to generate casualty figures on its own. Yet the UN has cited it for months on end. And the big kerfuffle at the start of May that had everyone confused was the UN switching from citing the Government Media Office to the Ministry of Health. Now, the problem with the Government Media Office is that from the time that they started reporting, their reports have conflicted and cannot be reconciled with the Ministry of Health reporting. It requires a negative number of men to be coming from media reports. And I wrote about this actually last week with some tables that illustrate that point. So you have a problem of the international community apparently not understanding who they should be citing, who's the actual official claim, and then not understanding even what that official claim is. The combination of those two things is particularly toxic when it comes to certain claims that acquired great salience in the early months of the war, specifically the claim that 70% of those killed in Gaza were women and children. Now, that was true, I think, through the end of October, based on the Ministry of Health's reporting. So you have to say, if you're going by the Ministry of Health. But even if you're going by the Ministry of Health and taking what they say at face value, that hasn't been true since the very first time they reported more detailed numbers in December. Now, the Ministry of Health only stopped saying 70% at the end of March, and the Government Media Office still says it. But that claim had enormous salience and was cited by American politicians. It came up in South Africa's testimony at the ICJ. It was no doubt part of the background of what the panel of experts at the ICC reviewed before making their agreeing with the prosecutor to issue arrest warrants against the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister of Israel. These numbers have enormous resonance, and getting them right is important. And a key problem is that the UN has really diverged from its best practices when it comes to casualty reporting. The UN is normally very strict. They have not been strict here. Now what you see is a lot of statements that their spokespeople are making that are not exactly true, but it's because the gulf between what they were reporting and then what the Ministry of Health was actually reporting became too great. I'll only give a brief window into the demographics of what's going on, and we don't have full data because these media reports have no information attached to them. But when it comes to the hospital and morgue reports and the reports by relatives, combined, those account for about 24,600 deaths of the overall 35,000 claimed. And what we know from those is that close to 46% are adult men, about 23% are adult women, and about 31% are children. And what's important is to compare that to the total population of Gaza, which is about half children and about a quarter each adult men and women. So what does that mean? It means women are slightly underrepresented, children are very underrepresented, and men are extremely overrepresented. And then you want to look at what's the age range in which men are particularly overrepresented. Having done this calculation this morning, men between the ages of 18 and 45, which you can expand on either side, but 18 to 45 is what we could reasonably say is fighting age, make up close to 35% of those killed, but they only make up about 21% of the population. So you see this very large overrepresentation. And we also need to bear in mind that the death toll reporting by the Ministry of Health is likely not capturing Hamas fighters dying in tunnels or in Jabalia or very far from any method by which they'd be recorded. And an indication of that is that the reports by families, which aren't subject to the restraints of a morgue nearby, are pushing upwards of 55 to 60% adult men. So drastically out of proportion with their proportion of the population. So by all indications, what that looks like is a military operation that's resulted in high numbers of adult men being killed and relatively lower numbers than you would expect if it was some sort of indiscriminate operation. A final point is that when you look at the kind of average daily death toll, which is one metric of how intense the war is or how careful the IDF is being or the nature of the fighting, in the month of October, the average daily death toll was 341 people per day, which I think we can all agree is extremely high. In the month of April, it was 56. So there's been a drastic decline in the death toll over time, but that hasn't been matched by the rhetoric, certainly from the international community or the American administration. If anything, it's actually been the inverse. U.S. criticism of Israeli conduct in the war, which specifically focused on civilian harm, including civilian death, really started to increase in December and January and hit its peak in April, which is kind of totally counter to what was going on the ground.
What lessons do we learn in reporting future conflict? How can we be careful or more careful even as this conflict evolves? How should we be more careful as observers, and how should reporters be more careful, unless they don't want to be because they have an ideology?
I've spoken to people at 5 or 6 national U.S. newspapers in the last 2 weeks. None of them knew about most of the data sources I was mentioning. This is just not something they've looked into. There's a general perception of how death tolls in war work, and it's generally accurate, which is that it's almost always an undercount. But that relies on the UN using a very strict methodology that does drastically undercount the number of people killed. But when the UN does not apply its own methodology and trusts claims by the parties, then you need to look really carefully at the methodology of those parties to the conflict. So whoever is making the claim, you should apply the exact same scrutiny. If Israel is making a claim about how many people were killed on October 7th, then you look at their methodology. Are they using social security data? Are they using hospital reports? And in Israel's case, it actually does check out. And you can see that, especially because Israel revised its count about a month after the war. That's what a professional system looks like, one that's being honest and open. In the case of the Gaza Ministry of Health, what you see is they mix methodologies together and are not transparent about which ones they're using, and they do a lot to obfuscate the release of information outside investigation. So everyone's just got to look closely at the methodology and do some addition on your own to see if it lines up. Take into account that there is chaos, but if things really don't make sense, it should be explained by the body reporting those numbers. If it's not, it's a sign that something deeper is at play.
Kobi, you said Israel was in a strategic limbo. Then you said that some of the choices that were made were problematic. Was the choices that Israel made its own decisions, or do you think it was being urged to make what you classified as problematic decisions because of advice it took from outside parties, including the United States?
There are several reasons to some wrong decisions or absence of decisions, which is also a sort of a decision. When you decide not to decide, it is a decision. The main problem that we had is the hostages and the negotiation, the domestic pressure, and the Israeli sensitivity with regard to the hostages and the real hope that we will be able to release as many hostages as possible. If you ask me, as one who deals with the Palestinian issue and with Hamas for more than 3 decades, I would have said that there is no even a slight chance that such a deal will be approved. And I think that here we are coming to the second reason, which is one of the most significant reasons, the United States of America and its policy towards the issue itself and towards Israel as an ally. And here I saw some unbelievable things that were made by the US administration that eventually caused a situation where the leadership of Hamas in the Gaza Strip felt that they are in a comfort strategic zone, which means that they have no incentive to make any concessions or to be more flexible, but on the contrary, they believe that the time works in favor of them. And furthermore, they believe that the international community, including the US, work for them. And therefore, they are in a sort of a win-win situation, or at least were in a win-win situation. They are deep in the tunnels beneath the ground, but they are very well connected to the reality on the ground. And they understand and they see what is going there on the ground. They see the international pressure on Israel. They see that Israel is pushed to the corner by international tribunals, accused in genocide. Now the ICC intends, or at least the prosecutor intends, to ask warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Gallant. They see how the tension between Israel and the United States is built up. They see how the tension between the political echelon and the military echelon in Israel is built up. By the way, this is another reason to the question that you asked. There is a sort of disharmony between the military echelon, the political echelon, and inside the political echelon itself. And they see the rifts or the disputes among the Israeli society and the growing mistrust of the Israeli society towards the political echelon. And according to the last poll that was conducted by the INSS, we see a very significant decrease of the trust of the public in the IDF itself. This is a very dramatic change. So the leaders of Hamas, who are 15 floors under the ground, sit and think what eventually we have to do. We just have to wait. And we are in a win-win situation, because if we will be able to pressure Israel by using the Americans, the Qatarians, and the Egyptians to make a further mile or step towards our demands, then it will be considered as our ultimate victory and the ultimate defeat of Israel. We will remain the sovereign power. We forced on Israel our demands with regard to the hostage deal. We are going to cease the war and we will be able to recover ourselves. And if Israel will not accept our demand and will be pushed to a ground incursion to Rafah, then it will be attacked by the United States of America that rejects the idea of Operation Rafah, will be criticized in a very severe manner by the international community. It will ignite a very significant tension between Israel and Egypt, and it will create or will increase the tension in the Israeli society between those who believe that only by increasing the military pressure we will be able to release the hostages, and those who believe that we have to do all the efforts in order to release the hostages here and now, even by ceasing completely the war and admitting that we lost the war. I think that the United States of America, with its very weird policy, provided the leadership of Hamas with many incentives not to make a step further. How absurd is the attitude of the American administration? First of all, with regard to Qatar. Qatar is the most significant player with regard to Hamas because it has the most significant leverage over Hamas. And Qatar is fully dependent on the US. Qatar is a very funny country of less than 400,000 citizens and more than 1 million slaves, which is totally defended by the United States of America, totally dependent on the alliance with the United States of America. And instead of pressuring Qatar and bringing Qatar on its knees on the first day of the war by setting an ultimatum, an American ultimatum to the Qatarian, you have 24 hours to evacuate Qatar from all the leaders of Hamas. There will not be even a single leader of Hamas on Qatarian soil. You have 24 hours to stop any kind of support in Hamas, and you have 24 hours to shut down Al Jazeera with regard to its incitement, because Al Jazeera is the most dangerous media platform in the world. Al Jazeera ignites all the streets in the entire Arab world. And if you are not going to do that, you are going to remain alone. And instead of doing that, the United States of America continue appeasing Qatar, making Qatar as the princess of diplomacy here in the region. And a month and a half ago, the State Department even published an official document that Qatar is a strategic asset for the United States, that the relations between Qatar and the United States are very important, glorifying Qatar. Now, next week, we are going to talk about the campuses in the United States. I recommend you to find somebody who understands and knows who is behind all of the riots in the campuses, who are the Muslim Brotherhood organizations of radical Muslims among Muslim communities in the United States that organize all the riots. And who financed them? Follow the money. Who is financing them? I will be the spoiler and I will tell you that Qatar is financing them. And actually, Qatar works against the most basic values and interests of the United States on the American soil, and it is still considered as a strategic American asset. This is something which is unbelievable. Secondly, the idea of threatening Israel publicly, the idea of humiliating Israel by saying that there is a need to distinguish between the Israeli government or the elected Israeli prime minister and the Israeli people. Or Chuck Schumer, who says that Israel has to go to election in order to replace its prime minister, or to halt the shipment of weapons. All of these eventually signal to Hamas and to the other proxies of Iran and to Iran itself. The last things that were made by the American administration eventually are the idea of normalizing Hamas. Because if the United States of America says, the administration says that they support the objectives of the war and they support the idea that Hamas will be dismantled, but in the very same time, they tie the hands of Israel behind its back and do not allow Israel to continue dismantling Hamas. And if they reject the idea of a ground operation in Rafah, what does it mean? It means that they know that Hamas will remain as the sovereign power in Rafah. They normalize the left assets of Hamas in Rafah. And the pier that was built by the Americans intend to transfer the authority for the operation of the pier to whom? To Qatar. And Qatar intends to operate this pier by using local company in Gaza, El Khisi company, which is Hamas. So eventually the Americans built the pier in order to enable Hamas to operate the pier by using Qatar. What is this if not normalizing Hamas? What are the reasons? There are 3-4 major reasons. The first one is the hostages and the negotiation and the huge sensitivity in this regard. The second thing is the American administration and its policy or its approach and the unbelievable pressure that it put on Israel. The third one is the disharmony in the political echelon and between the political echelon and the military echelon. And the fourth reason is the idea of the tensions or the disputes inside the Israeli society. And we remember where we were until October 7th or until October 6th. And I think that the vast majority of the Israeli public does not want to return to October 6th. So we have to be very, very sensitive with regard to the approaches, with regard to the strategy, and with regard to the tension between the objectives of the war with regard to Hamas and the idea of releasing the hostages. I hope that now, after beginning the operation in Rafah, we are in a different situation. I think that the gaps between the American administration and Israel are narrowing now, although the gaps still exist there, but I think that we are able to narrow the gaps. And I hope that we will be determined enough in order to do what we have to do in the Gaza Strip and beyond, because we are concentrating on Rafah and the Gaza Strip. But the biggest problem that the state of Israel has is Hezbollah and the Northern Front. And there, they are looking to Gaza and they see what is going there in Gaza. They see what is the policy or the approach of the American administration. And Iran and Hezbollah feel that they are in a comfort zone as well, because America is very reluctant to attack Iranian assets. America is very reluctant with regard to the expansion of the regional war and with regard to the idea of American boots on the ground. And therefore, the Iranians feel that they have the ability to pressure Hezbollah to intensify the war against Israel. And Israel prefers to finish the war in Gaza and only then to open or to broaden the second front. But we have to remember that 80,000 people from the north, from Kiryat Shmoni and all the kibbutzim and the villages along the border are not there. They were evacuated. And eventually, the security perimeter is not in the Lebanese side, it's in the Israeli side. And Israel, as a sovereign state, is not able to bring back its citizens to their homes for 8 months.
Gabriel, you've watched American foreign policy evolve, being in Washington and being associated with some incredible minds at the Washington Institute. What kind of comments would you make to some aspects of American foreign policy as you've seen it unfold?
The U.S. was not anticipating this any more than Israel. And the U.S. global foreign policy they were trying to push was very much focused on defending Europe against Russian aggression via Ukraine, bleeding Russia dry, and trying to pivot to compete with China. This was not something they were prepped for. You can see that by Jake Sullivan having a very unfortunately timed essay published in Foreign Affairs talking about anything but the Middle East right after October 7th. The U.S. was trying to keep this off the agenda, as a lot of administrations have done, and that's never worked. But then again, rolling up your sleeves and diving in has not always worked either. So the administration's approach in this war has been very hands-on from the start. It started out as a bear hug. It might be turning into more of a straitjacket as time goes on. But a common refrain that we hear in DC is that the policy is Biden, no matter which direction it's going. And so all those months during some of the really more aggressive parts of the war with heavy aerial bombardment, very high civilian casualties, it was Biden holding the line against advisors inside the administration, State Department, even at the NSC, and holding the policy of support to Israel. So the shift in U.S. policy actually took quite a long time to come. But now that it's come, it's having a real biting effect, and the administration has struggled to figure out its messaging on Rafah. I think it is worth it to say, though, that when Netanyahu first telegraphed moves into Rafah, the IDF was in no way positioned to go and do that, but it started a clock with the international community and with the U.S. in which they received enormous pressure to prevent an operation in Rafah that was at that point not even on the horizon. And it led to kind of a crescendo that didn't necessarily need to exist. You could have started that wave and started that clock at a much later point, and you would have been able to act more decisively in that regard. But I think Kobi is right that the U.S. was pretty much wrong about how fast Rafah could be evacuated. It's not orderly by any means, and there are really serious concerns about the provision of humanitarian aid, medical services, water and sanitation, with a lot of people crammed into Al-Mawasi, the humanitarian area in the south of Khan Yunis. But you have seen the U.S. messaging adapt pretty quickly. It's like almost a yellow light, I think we've seen in the last 24 hours, a slightly scaled down version of what the IDF is planning in Rafah. So there is some narrowing of the gaps. But National Security Advisor Sullivan last week during a White House press briefing focused in on the criticism that the Israeli military strategy is not tied to a political strategy and that will lead in the end to strategic failure. And that's been the centerpiece of American criticism for the last week. And I think it's going to be like that going forward. You saw multiple generals, both retired and then some high-level DoD people come out and talk about this as well. And I think that's now the point where the U.S. administration sees their criticism as most effective, because simultaneously they're running a defensive effort for Israel when it comes to the ICC. So the U.S. is trying to walk a very fine line where they want to prevent a regional war, but they don't want to stop Israel from winning. That's not the intention. But at the same time, they're trying to criticize Israel to keep certain guardrails they see as important and to appease the domestic audience, while at the same time not allowing international criticism to run away and turning Israel into a pariah, or allowing Netanyahu or Gallant to end up in the dock at The Hague. You've seen them really struggle with the messaging. It's been a couple of rough months of people saying things that maybe they shouldn't have or going too far, it getting picked up and turning into a media cycle and then having to walk it back, then being accused of being inconsistent. This is not an easy task for any administration to follow, and I don't think it helps that a lot of lower level staffers in the administration have also been doing things that are kind of difficult to imagine in previous years. Anonymous letters, anonymous protests, a lot of low and mid-level resignations that blow up into a huge media cycle. These things all make it difficult to have a coherent, cohesive policy coming out of the White House. But I think very clearly the line that the administration has tried to walk is they support Israel's objectives. They don't necessarily support all of its tactical decisions or its operational plans. That does allow the gaps to be narrowed. but it's not an easy process. And certainly events on the ground don't help. Things like attacks on the humanitarian aid convoys in the West Bank do not play well in the US. I can say that safely. And certainly Israel appearing to restrict aid at different points into the Gaza Strip did not play well with the American audience. The US definitely has some messaging that it could probably do better, but the fundamental disagreement between the US wanting a certain post-war approach in Gaza and Israel not having decided on a post-war approach in Gaza, that clash is very real, and it's what's driving everything else. I think if that gap was narrowed, you would see a lot of the other US criticism or policy fall into line.
I think it's very difficult for us sitting in the United States to come up with a prescription on what tomorrow should look like, because we don't always understand the political culture or the variations of the political culture. And the other thing I'm reminded of is a conversation President Carter had in Damascus with Hafez al-Assad in 1987. And he was at the end of a discussion about releasing terrorists. And Assad said to former President Carter, "Mr. President, you have to remember that we in the Middle East operate according to a calendar, and you're so incredibly urging a desire to operate according to a clock. We don't operate according to a clock. We operate according to a calendar. And we also operate on the notion that if you wait 4 years, there'll be another person in the White House." I looked at Carter at the moment, and he just turned his head, shook his head, looked at me, and he said, "I think Assad's got it right." It was pretty telling for President Assad and former President Carter to agree on something at that moment in 1987. Kobi, Gabriel, thank you very much for your insights